We had spoken about the story of Elisha described in the Navi and the prophets, where Elisha said to a woman, "You will have a son this time next year," and so it was. As he said, so it was. In connection to that, there is a wonderful story about the Barditchever, Rabbi Yitzchak of Barditchev. In his congregation, in his city, in Poland, Hanukkah was celebrated with great festivities. The lighting of the menorah was an event that was joyful, with singing, with dancing for hours. One year, Rabbi Yitzchak, who was also the legal rabbi of the community, he dealt with legal questions, was very consumed by a complicated civil suit that was kind of dampening his enjoyment of the menorah lighting and the joy of the event. And he said, almost to himself, but out loud, if someone would relieve me of this burden, I would share my portion in the world to come with him, my portion in heaven. One chassid knew an opportunity when he saw one, and he said to Rabbi Yitzchak, "How much is the disputed amount? What are they fighting over?" And he said it was about 400 ruble, which was a lot of money in those days. The man said, "If I give you the 400 ruble, can you just settle the case that way?" And he said, "Sure, that would be fine." So he ran home and he brought 400 ruble and he gave it to Rabbi Yitzchak, who was very relieved and tuned his attention to the lighting of the menorah, and it was a great and festive event that year. When everybody else had left, this chassid waited to see how this deal with Rabbi Yitzchak is going to be completed. Rabbi Yitzchak called him into his room and wrote a little note on a piece of paper and handed it to him and said, "Make sure that this is buried with you, but don't read it." So the man, being a very sincere, honest individual, sewed the note into the cover, the cloth cover of his siddur, of his prayer book, the one that he used every day all his life. In his later years, this man decided that he wanted to be buried in Israel. And so he made the long, difficult journey to the Holy Land. And soon after he arrived there, he took ill. And when the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, came to make arrangements, he mentioned to them that the siddur that he uses every day must be buried with him. And they made a note of it. A year later, when the illness seemed to be terminal, and he felt that his last days were approaching, he again called the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, to make final arrangements, and again emphasized very strongly the need or the importance of burying the siddur with him. And they became curious, and they asked him why the siddur had to be buried with him. And so he said, "It's because I have a note there from Rabbi Yitzchak of Barditchev, because he promised me that I would share his portion in the world to come. And he had made me promise not to read it." The members of the burial society in Jerusalem were all very holy people who studied Kabbalah. And they were sure that what was written on that note would be some Kabbalistic formula that was known only to the holiest of men, and that they would benefit greatly by reading it and becoming more knowledgeable in this Kabbalistic matter. They were very tempted to open the binding and read what their Levi Yitzchak had written. They were somewhat concerned with the fact that he had made the chassid promise not to read it, but finally reasoned that he was not allowed to read it because he was not a student of Kabbalah. But since they were students of Kabbalah, it would be only right that they should further their studies by opening the seam and reading the Kabbalistic formulas that they were sure was written on that note. And so they did. They opened it up and they read it. And they were stunned by what they saw. Written on the note was one sentence. It said, "Open for him the gates of righteousness," signed Levi Yitzchak ben Sar. There was no Kabbalah, and there was no magical formulas, not even mystical formulas. It was the wish and the words of a tzaddik that are always obeyed. He says, and so it was. Along a similar line, when the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Ladi, began to teach the philosophy of Chabad, he insisted that people actually study and become knowledgeable in the teachings of Hasidus. And that miracles, which people came to expect from holy men, the Baal Shem Tov had performed endless numbers of miracles. But the Alter Rebbe insisted that this was not his style and that he wasn't into doing miracles, and that what he was all about and what he insisted and demanded from his Hasidim is the study and the understanding and the application of the teachings of Hasidus. There was a woman who had a very serious problem and wanted to bring it to the Alter Rebbe. But it was a very busy time of the year, and she couldn't get an appointment. So she went to see the Alter Rebbe's wife, the Rebbitzin, and told her of the seriousness of her problem. The Alter Rebbe's wife, the Rebbitzin, suggested that she write her problem down on a piece of paper and give it to her young son, who could easily slip into the crowd and make his way to the front of the room, and have her son hand the note to the Alter Rebbe, and that way she will receive his blessing. Now, this boy had his own problems. He was mute and hadn't spoken a word all his life. The mother followed the Rebbitzин's advice. She wrote her problem down on the paper, gave it to her son, and said, "Bring this note to the Alter Rebbe and hand it to him." The boy found a way to crawl through the crowd and under the tables and make his way up to the Alter Rebbe. And he handed the Alter Rebbe the note during one of the breaks in the talks and the proceedings. The Alter Rebbe read the note and said to the boy, "Go tell your mother to do the following," or to go to a certain place where her problem will be solved. The boy went and told his mother. The mother almost fainted. The boy had never spoken a word in his life. And so she went off to follow the advice of the Rebbe, and her problem was solved. But someone approached the Alter Rebbe and said, "You said you don't do miracles. How did you make this little boy talk?" And the Alter Rebbe said, "I didn't know he was mute." So again we see that the miracles performed by the truly holy and great leaders is not a conscious thing where they decide to do a miracle. It rather comes from the fact that their will is pure and selfless, and so what they ask for and what they demand happens. Nature obeys holiness. And that's what it means when God created light on the first day, and He created grass and trees and animals, and on each day, except for Monday, God said, "It is good." He saw the light and it was good. He saw what He had made and it was good. What was good about trees? What was good about animals? The Torah is saying that nature is good. In what way is nature good? Good seems to be a moral term. How do you apply a moral term to a tree? It can be a healthy tree. It can be a big tree. It can be, the fruit of the tree can be delicious, but can it be a good tree? And the answer is, there is a goodness in nature, in that nature obeys holiness. It facilitates holiness. And so when the Alter Rebbe said to this boy, "Go tell your mother," it simply happened because that's what he said. Didn't even know he was performing a miracle. One of the most inspiring stories happened more recently. And this was soon after the 6-Day War, I believe, when a diplomat from Israel was visiting with the Rebbe in Brooklyn. At the end of their long conversation, the Rebbe said to this diplomat, "When are you going back to Israel?" And he said, "Tomorrow." And the Rebbe smiled and said, "What's the hurry? Stay a little longer." And the man said, "Thank you very much," and left. He was driving back to Manhattan when his driver asked him what had they spoken about? What did the Rebbe say? And he said, well, much of it was strategic military things that he cannot repeat. But he said, the Rebbe is such a gentleman. He asked me when I'm leaving, and I said tomorrow, and the Rebbe says, stay a little longer. He's so nice. The driver, being a little more familiar with the Rebbe and Hasidim, said, if the Rebbe asked you to stay and not go back so soon, surely you're going to take that seriously, and you're going to stay. And he said, no, I hadn't thought of that. I thought the Rebbe was just being polite. And he said, that's not the way things are with a Rebbe. It wasn't idle talk. If he says to stay, I think you should stay. And so thinking it over, he decided that he would do that. And he canceled his flight and rebooked a flight for the next week. The flight that he was going to be on was hijacked to Algeria. And it was a mystery in the papers and in the media. It was a mystery because no one ever claimed responsibility for the hijacking. The hijackers made no demands, and after 12 hours or something like that, they simply freed the hostages and allowed the plane to leave. At the time, the explanation given in the media was that they wanted the plane to go on. They were simply refueling in Algeria, wanted to go on to some other country, but no country would accept them. But it's also likely that they hijacked the plane because they wanted to kidnap this minister. And he wasn't on the plane. When the minister got back to Israel, he of course told everyone in the Knesset that the Rebbe had saved his life, or at least saved him from a terrible ordeal of being kidnapped, because he was going to be on that flight, and the Rebbe told him not to be. And so the buzz, or the word, got around in Israel that the Rebbe had performed a miracle, had been prescient of the fact that this flight would be hijacked, and had saved the minister by telling him not to get on the flight. About a year later, a rabbi from England, who was a close friend of this minister, was visiting with the Rebbe. And he said, if the Rebbe doesn't mind, could I ask a personal question? He said, my friend, the minister, told me that the Rebbe had saved him from the hijacked flight. But why would the Rebbe save only one person? If the Rebbe knew that the flight was going to be hijacked, why not call the airline, cancel the flight altogether, tell them to look out for the terrorists, and save everyone the ordeal of being hijacked to Algeria? Why does the minister get special attention? And the Rebbe's answer is the most inspiring of all the stories. The Rebbe basically said, when I'm speaking to someone, I am obsessed with the need and the desire to do him a favor, to do something good, to do something helpful for the person I'm speaking with. And in that desire and in that obsession, I said to him that he should stay and not get on the flight. Which means the Rebbe was saying that he didn't know that the flight would be hijacked. The reason he asked that the minister not get on the plane, those words, the Rebbe said, came not from prophecy, not from being clairvoyant, not from seeing what others don't see. The words were motivated, were stimulated by this intense desire to do what is right, to do a favor to the person that he was speaking to. Which means that this great intense love that one has for another person can actually produce the right words, the right advice, the right instructions. But it's coming not from prophecy, it's coming from concern. It's coming from empathy. It's coming from an intense maternal kind of love that brings the right words or the right thoughts to mind, and you end up giving the right advice. So the holiness with which great tzaddikim perform miracles is not a magical or mystical holiness, but a holiness that is very grounded in the love of a fellow Jew, in the respect for another human being, and in the total selfless devotion to serving the needs of others. And when one makes that kind of commitment, when one has that kind of commitment, then the effect of their words is really magical. It is not a disturbance of nature. It's rising above nature. When one human being can be so concerned for another human being that he senses the second person's needs even more than the person senses his own, that's not a violation of nature, but that does transcend nature. Because nature dictates that every person feels and experiences only their own pain, only their own hunger, only their own needs. When we rise above that nature, we become capable of feeling another person's needs, another person's hunger, another person's pain, and of course, another person's joy, and another person's success, another person's pleasure. And when we rise above nature, because of the holiness and because of the goodness that dictates that we be greater and bigger than nature, then nature helps. Nature actually cooperates and enables us to do what seems to be miraculous. Going back to the Alter Rebbe, we have another story that describes this process very graphically. It was when the Alter Rebbe had been arrested by the Tsar, accused of trying to overthrow the government in favor of Turkey, because the Alter Rebbe sent huge sums of money to support the tiny Jewish community in Israel. And Israel at that time was under Turkish rule. And Turkey was at war with the Tsar. And so the Alter Rebbe sending money to Israel was interpreted as supporting the Turks against the Tsar. So he was arrested. And the prison in which he was held had two structures: the office, the headquarters, and then the prison block. And these two structures were separated by a river. So when the prisoner needed to be interrogated, they ferried him across the river to the offices. The Alter Rebbe was being ferried across the river. He was in jail for 53 days. And during those days, he was being ferried across the river. And it was that time of the month when the new moon had appeared. And there's the prayer that we say for the new moon. The Alter Rebbe wanted to fulfill that mitzvah. And here he was under the sky. The moon was visible. So he asked the boatman to stop the boat, because when you're praying or when you're saying prayers out of the siddur, you should be able to concentrate on what you're saying. And in a moving boat, it's hard to concentrate. And so he asked him to stop the boat for the few minutes that it would take to say the prayer. The boatman, of course, refused. The Alter Rebbe asked him a second time. And a second time, the boatman refused. All of a sudden, the boat became stationary in the water. It wouldn't budge. Like a painted ship upon a painted ocean. The boatman was frightened. He realized that this was a holy man, and that if he wanted the boat to stop, the boat would stop. The Rebbe then asked him again if he would agree to stop the boat. And here the man made a deal with the Rebbe. He asked the Rebbe for a blessing in return for stopping the boat, and then agreed to stop the boat. And then the Rebbe stood up and said the prayer for the new moon. When the Rebbe would tell this story, he would always ask the question, the obvious question. The Alter Rebbe asked him to stop the boat, and even agreed to give him a blessing in exchange for his agreeing to stop the boat. All of this after the boat was already standing still in the water. Why did he need the boatman's approval or agreement when the boat had already stopped? And the Rebbe's explanation is that the whole idea of Torah being observed by human beings on earth, in the physical, in the flesh, is to bring godliness to where there is no godliness, into the physical condition. So the world that God created, with all the laws of nature, is the place in which God wants holiness and godliness, mitzvahs, to permeate and become its true nature. When the boat stopped, miraculously, the Alter Rebbe did not want to fulfill the mitzvah and say the prayers in that miraculous, unnatural circumstance. Because then the mitzvah would not be permeating into the laws of nature. You would be doing a mitzvah into a miracle, not into nature. And so even after the boat had stopped and the boatman was very impressed and frightened by the holiness of it, he still needed the boatman's approval and agreement to stop the boat naturally. And only then would he do the mitzvah. So once the boatman agreed to stop the boat, then the mitzvah that the Rebbe would do and the prayer that the Rebbe would say would be affecting, reaching, permeating a natural, normal circumstance that needed to become holier. And so the idea of all of the stories about miracles and magical performances by Moshe and by the prophets and by later tzaddikim throughout all of history is not meant to give the miraculous more credit than the natural. It's not that we should desire the miraculous in favor of the natural, but instead, the idea is that just as nature obeys God's commandments as they are voiced through the tzaddikim and through the leaders of each generation, we should be inspired by that to obey God's commandments to us. So when the people saw that the rock would give water, they were inspired. I mean, we shouldn't be worse than a rock. If nature obeys God, then certainly we should obey God. But the main point is, when we obey God, we're not being miraculous. It's not that we break our nature in order to do a mitzvah. It's with our nature that we do the mitzvah. So that when we come to light the menorah on Hanukkah, for example, or light the Shabbos candles, etc., we do it with our nature because it is in nature to be good.
Partner with Rabbi Friedman. Visit itsgoodtoknow.org/support.